Cool. Thanks so much, Joanne and Shelley, for organizing this event. It's a real pleasure to be here and to speak with you guys today about the work that we've been doing in the Central Coast for the last few years on strawberry farms, primarily. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that this is a really big team effort. It's definitely not just me out there. We've got a big crew of people from, in addition to UC Davis, from Berkeley, from Riverside, from Washington State University, from University of Kentucky, from the University of British Columbia. Lots of people have been working on this project together. And in particular, I really want to highlight Alyssa Olympi, who was a postdoc with me, and Karina Garcia, who is a grad student with David Gonthier. Both of them have done a ton of this work, and really it wouldn't be happening without them. So kind of starting off at a broad view, I'm a conservation biologist. That's sort of my background. So why would I, as a conservation biologist, work in agricultural systems? Why would I come to study agriculture? Well, for a very long time, conservation biologists focused all of our efforts on just setting up ecological reserves, national parks, protected areas. And we thought that was, really the best way out there to conserve wildlife. And over time, the amount of protected areas has grown on Earth to be now around 15% of Earth's surface. And it's a pretty good number. But that number sort of pales in comparison to the amount of Earth's surface that's covered with farms and pastures, which sits somewhere around 40% of the land on Earth, depending on how you measure it. So back in the early 2000s, late 1990s, a group of scientists started getting together and asking, is there anything we could do to sort of better co-manage these farms and pastures, but both for people and wildlife? And so that's what sort of got me interested in this whole topic. Is there anything that we could do to conserve wildlife on farms? A lot of my work has taken place actually in the tropics. I do a lot of work in Costa Rica. Here's a picture of one of the landscapes where I work in Northwest Costa Rica. And here are just some of the birds that I would regularly see on farms as we do our surveys in Costa Rica. And we've just seen that if you do things like, having patches of habitat of, in this case, tropical rainforest in or around your farm fields, you can get really remarkable species on your farms. And it's definitely not just the tropics. One of the studies that I always like to highlight when I'm talking is done in the Midwest in Iowa and led by Lisa Schulte-Moore, the so-called Prairie Strips Project, which is just this unbelievable program that has shown that having these small patches of prairie, of native prairie in the corn soy landscape along these field edges can do wonders for biodiversity, increasing flowering plant diversity for fold, huge numbers of pollinators and birds. And then the outcomes for farmers have been remarkable in terms of nutrient retention, sedimentation, a lot of really key outcomes, such that this program of adding prairie strips is now an NRCS practice and is just exploding all throughout the Midwest. But I didn't come here to talk to you guys about the tropics or about the Midwest. I came here to talk to you guys about our backyards in California and the Central Coast. And that's what I've been really interested in for the last few years, of asking, what are birds doing on these strawberry farms in the Central Coast? Are they providing us with benefits or costs, and how could we better manage them? And we know from speaking with farmers that birds do a lot of different things on these strawberry farms. Most apparent is that birds like to eat the berries just like we do, and so they might act as pests of strawberries, damaging them and eating them. Farmers are also very concerned about fecal contamination of strawberries and other fresh produce, both because people don't want to eat anything that's been contaminated with poop, and because of all of the food safety issues, the proliferation of concern concerning Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter, and other diseases that birds might potentially host. But then we've also been talking about today about some benefits. So birds might be eating the bugs that eat the strawberries. For example, we've got a picture here of strawberries' primary insect pests, lygus insects. And then we could complicate the story even more. Birds might actually be also eating the bugs that eat the lygus. This is, in the scientific term, intraguild predation, or just the consumption of these beneficial insects like these big-eyed bugs. So birds might be doing all of these things. So what we set out to determine was, first, what is the net effect of birds on strawberry production? when you average all of those different actions together, are they net positive or net negative? And then second, and even more importantly, how does your actions on the farm affect that balance of costs and benefits associated with birds? Then finally, we were really interested in diving deeper into these food safety risk questions, just because that's something that's really on the mind of a lot of growers and sort of preventing them from thinking about conserving birds or their habitats in and around the farm. So what are the food safety risks of birds? And that's what I'm gonna seek to talk to you guys about today. So the study system. We've been working across 20 different organic strawberry farms, and we specifically chose those farms in the Central Coast to vary both in the kind of amount of habitat surrounding the farm. So here you can see these red farms have little amounts of natural or semi-natural habitat in the areas around their farm. Versus these green ones have a lot. And so, you know, Dennis's Blue Heron farm would be more in the green category over here. But then also the practices on the farm, whether there is diversification, like planting multiple crops, integrating hedgerows, all of those kinds of practices. So we chose those 20 farms to be able to look at those two things. And then one of the first things that we wanted to do was see who was doing what birds were doing what actions on the farm. So what did we do? Well, we would put up these mesh nets along the edges of the fields, and then birds would fly into them. Here you can see a bird that got trapped in this net, and we would take the bird out of that net, carefully extracting it, checking the net every couple, 20 minutes to make sure they don't stay in the net too long. And then we put them in these sterilized cloth bags and move them to this station where we could measure them and look at them, figure out what they were. But they would leave us a present in these sterile cotton bags along the way. About 95% of them poop in these bags. And that was what we were interested in. We were really weighing into the bird poop for this project and taking it out of these bags, putting it into vials. And then what we could do is we could actually take the DNA sequences out of the poop to figure out what they were eating. We could build whole diet profiles, figuring out what insects they're eating, what plants they're eating, as well as what bacteria might be in that poop, in particular, the ones of food safety concern, so E. coli, Salmonella, and Campylobacter. And so over the course of a lot of work across all those farms, we ended up capturing a bunch of birds and getting about 1,000 different fecal samples from 1,000 different birds of 50 different species, and then sequencing them all. Here are a picture of a couple of the birds that we were able to work with. And so we would get back this really remarkable data that would tell us the kind of feeding relationships of birds. So here is just a few of the species that we caught on farms that we know now are definitely consuming Lygus hesperus, which is, the primary insect pest of coffee, which is, or of strawberries, which is great. But on the other hand, we also found strawberries in all of these species poops as well. So we know that these birds are doing both things. And what's really important then is to figure out what the balance is. If they're eating both insects and strawberries, what does that mean in terms of their net effect for the farmer? To get at that, we need to do an experiment. And this is an exclusion experiment where we would build these cages and put them out around our strawberry plants, and the birds can't get in and feed now. And we would pair these cages with these open sort of controls where the birds would come in and be able to eat. We did this on 14 of our farms, and we would have 3 pairs of these cages and controls on different parts of the farm. And then we would monitor all of the berries in there for berry damage, and we would also look for the insects inside, do some insect surveys as well. So what was our takeaway from this study? Well, insects were far more of a problem than birds were in terms of direct damage. Somewhere around 30% of the berries had some degree of insect damage, whereas birds were far lower, like less than 5% of the berries were damaged. Surprisingly though, when you integrate the benefits and costs of birds, we still found that the net effect of birds was slightly negative overall. So having birds caused 3% loss in yield when you balance out the direct consumption of birds of the strawberries, the pest control benefits, as well as them eating the beneficial bugs. And this is likely due to the fact that birds do like to eat strawberries and that they will consume those beneficial insects, all right? But then The real question then starts to be then, okay, we know that at least for strawberries, birds are doing a little bit more harm than good, but how does different management practices shift that balance of benefits to costs? And one of the key things that we found was when we look at the diet of birds, when we look to see whether strawberries are present in that bird poop, here you can actually see some strawberry caked on the bill of this house finch right here, we found that birds were actually less likely to consume strawberries on the farms that had more habitat around them. And when we would do surveys looking for strawberries and bird damage, here you can see characteristic bird damage, these kind of triangular marks, as well as birds flicking the seeds on the plastic mulch. We saw significantly fewer signs of bird damage on farms with more habitat around them as well. So while birds might be sort of a net negative impact, if you had more habitat around the farm, they were less likely to be damaging your strawberries. What about the consumption of pests and beneficial insects? Here, we actually saw some surprising things as well. We actually saw that there were more pests and more beneficial insects in bird poop when we had farms that were actually didn't have that much habitat around the farm field. And birds were less likely to eat pests and beneficial insects when you had more habitat around. Now that might be surprising, and why would that be? Well, there's a couple possibilities. One might be there are just relatively more pests and thus more beneficial insects following those pests when you have less habitat around the farm field. That's been shown for a variety of different types of systems around the world. So there might be more availability of these things for birds to eat. And sort of conversely, it might be that birds are tending to eat the other types of insects that exist in that surrounding habitat, that those are preferential for them when the habitat is around. All right. So now we know what they're eating, but now let's go back to the exclusion experiment and ask, all right, what we really care about is that balance of costs and benefits to look at the net impact on the strawberry yields, all right? So what happens for farms that are or are not surrounded by habitat with that? So here is an example farm, one of the farms we were working at, where we were able to model the cost impact of birds across the farm. And you can see that across the farm, the impact of birds, as we showed before, is sort of universally negative, but very slightly. It's a pretty slight negative impact. And this reflects that there are these birds like this spotted towhee that are sort of moving throughout the farm, eating occasional strawberries or eating occasional pests and beneficial insects, but as we learned from the previous slides, they're not doing that much of that on this farm in terms of eating the pests and beneficial insects, and so the effect is really slight. But what about the farms without any habitat surrounding them? Well, here you see a really interesting pattern. So at the field edges, you see really severe negative costs of birds. At the edges of the fields, you have these birds like these house finches coming in and eating a lot of strawberries, and you have other birds eating a lot of beneficial insects all along the edges. And then in the center of the fields, you get birds like this barn swallow here that are actually providing a lot of benefits. They're eating so many pests relative to all of these birds that are eating the crops that we actually see a net benefit. So the real question then becomes, let's pose some counterfactuals. Let's use our models and ask ourselves, all right, what if I was to take this farm and then add habitat all around it so that this farm looks more like this one? And then conversely, what if I was to take all this habitat around this farm and get rid of it? What would happen to this net impact? Well, this is what happens. We actually see a 25% decrease in costs if we were to increase the amount of habitat around this farm from 0% to about 50%. Conversely, if we were to take all this habitat out on this farm, we would say a 75% increase in costs. So when you balance out all of this complexity of the different birds eating the different things, you see with more habitat around the farm field, you actually see kind of less impact of the birds. And when you take that habitat away, you see a lot more impact of birds. And that brings us to this question about food safety risks, okay? What is going on with that? And would habitat around the farm or birds be a real big problem because they could be spreading these foodborne illnesses? The first thing to note is that songbird feces were very rarely directly sort of touching the strawberries, but they're also very common in general in the strawberry fields. We see a lot of bird poop in these farms, but only 2 of the more than 10,000 strawberries we looked at had bird feces that were directly touching the strawberry. That said, we know that irrigation water could spread that, pathogens around. So just because it wasn't touching the strawberry doesn't mean it wasn't a problem. So what about the density of these feces? Well, we didn't see any evidence that the feces were more common on farms that were more diversified or surrounded by habitat. There was no effect of the habitat around the farm on the density of feces. However, there were effects on the density when you had more fences and wires around. Birds like to perch on these fences and wires and poop there. And so if you had a lot of fences and wires around, there were a lot of poop next to it. Pretty unsurprising, but does mean you should be a little bit cautious about putting up these fences right next to risky produce. All right, but this isn't actually getting at the question of what's going on with the pathogens themselves, all right? So let's look at the pathogens. And to do this, we not only used our data set that we put together, but we also compiled a bunch of data from other studies all across the Western US. 11,000 tests of pathogenic E. coli, Salmonella, and Campylobacter across 92 produce farms with 94 bird species arrayed all across the Western US. So this is the biggest data set with birds and foodborne illnesses and fresh produce that has ever existed. And so we can first look at just how common these pathogens are. And we find that both the STEC, the pathogenic E. coli, and the Salmonella are pretty dang rare. It's 0.2% and 0.5% of the birds that are testing positive for these guys, so very rare. Campylobacter, though, on the other hand, is much more common. About 8% of the birds were testing positive for Campylobacter. All right, so then what happens if we add habitat in or around our farm field? Are birds more likely or less likely to carry Campylobacter? And I won't show many graphs today, but here's one that I think is pretty compelling. And on the x-axis, we have the amount of the semi-natural habitat around the farm. So these ones have a lot of habitat around, and these ones don't. And on the y-axis, we have the probability that a bird is going to be carrying that Campylobacter, that pathogen. And you can see there's a negative relationship here. Farms that have more habitat around them are less likely to have birds that are carrying Campylobacter. And this sort of aligns with some of our prior work on E. coli prevalence rates in fresh produce that hasn't seen any evidence of having habitat around being a bad thing in terms of pathogenic E. coli in fresh produce. All right, so then let's ask, who are the players here? Which are the species that are carrying these foodborne pathogens? And we found that the species that tend to sometimes associate with livestock are the ones that we need to worry about. Those ones are more likely to carry pathogens, more likely to actually interact with the fresh produce, like come in contact with it, and then actually more likely to defecate it on it as well. So in this graphs, I've got whether this species tends to associate with livestock, yes or no. On this graph, I show that here the probability of detecting Campylobacter is higher if they associate with livestock. And then we did bird surveys and found that the likelihood of a bird coming in contact with that fresh produce, actually coming in contact with it, was much higher when the species was one that associated with livestock. And then lastly, we would actually collect these pieces of poop and then sequence them to figure out who actually was the bird that pooped. And we found that the ones that were attributed, there were many, many more pieces of poop that were attributed back to these birds that were associated with livestock compared to the ones that aren't. In contrast, birds that eat insects, like these bluebirds and tree swallows that we keep talking about, were much less likely, significantly less likely to carry pathogens. So to sum up, as we kind of look at a farm like Blue Heron Farm that has all this habitat around it, our studies to date would suggest that this is a good thing. I know that Blue Heron, you guys don't make kind of grow too many strawberries, but it would decrease the strawberry damage from birds. It would mitigate that sort of net costs of birds on yields. It would not affect fecal contamination rates that we see, the kind of density of feces, and it would reduce the likelihood of birds carrying Campylobacter. but that's what we've found so far. So I'd like to thank the USDA, growers, landowners, field assistants, and all of you guys for listening, and I think we're taking questions at the end. So I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.